Welcome. And here we are in another session in the GEN Online Summit. This is the third edition. And today I have the privilege of speaking here with Paul and Pip Atkins. We're going to dive into Prosocial and Prosocial as it applies in Ecovillages. So I'd love to invite you each to give a brief intro, and so we'll start it out.
Great. Pip, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Pip Atkins. I'm a member of Narara Ecovillage, which is north of Sydney in Australia. And I've been a member for 3.5 years. I currently own land and I'm building a house. And my professional background is executive organizational coaching. And I'm a coach and facilitator on the Prosocial Facilitator training course that Paul runs. And I've been informally using Prosocial really by just looking at the examples and reflecting on Narara Ecovillage is a Prosocial community already, and it is working well. So it's not a case of me needing to, after the fact, apply Prosocial, as it were, and yet I am available for, assisting and being involved with any relevant interventions that are needed at the Ecovillage. Thank you.
Hi, and my name is Paul Atkins. I'm an organisational psychologist. I've had a career that's been in sort of two main streams. One's been in academia and research, where my primary research interests were in relationships in organisations of all sorts, really, and communities. I'm interested in harmony, conflict resolution, and also mindfulness and well-being in groups and how that can contribute to improved relationships. So that was my research career, but also for over the last 15 or so years, I've had my own organisation, which has been very much focused on helping people in the spaces of leadership development and conflict resolution and communication skills and so forth. And about 8 years ago, or maybe longer now, I had the real pleasure of being introduced to David Sloan Wilson, and I joined the very early nascent prosocial movement at that point, and together we wrote the Prosocial book with Steve Hayes and co-founded now Prosocial.World, which is a not-for-profit based in Texas, dedicated to spreading ideas about prosociality in the world, and also to training people in practical techniques that they can use in groups of all sorts around the world. And I'll be giving you some examples, no doubt, of different applications and places where prosocial's been applied. Thank you very much for having me, Carla.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, and thank you, Paul, for that. And so, yeah, for the viewing and listening audience, so the word prosocial on the surface level, meaning, the opposite of antisocial, prosociality, that sort of thing. And yet there's really clearly a movement as well, right? So if you just want to give a little bit of a picture of the overview to give a feel for the listening audience, that'd be great. Yeah,
great. Well, I like to think of prosocial as 4 things. Okay, and I'm never quite sure which is the most important. It's an underlying idea, a sort of concept, a story about who we are as human beings. It's a process, a sort of set of techniques that you could potentially use in a particular order, or you could mix them up in different contexts. It's also, very importantly, an emerging community of practice that's supporting one another, including circles of practice like prosocial schools or prosocial families, prosocial business, and so forth. And it's a research agenda, and that's very, very important, because the whole of prosocial is strongly science-led. It's strongly based in evidence. So those four things, idea, process, community, and research, are important. I thought I might just talk a bit about each if we have time. So starting with the notion of the idea, what are we about? Lots of different ways to characterize that, but the one I'm enjoying at the moment is basically creating a world that works for everyone. And there are many, many groups, including most eco-villages, that are pulling in this similar sort of direction, which gives me a lot of hope, because it's very much about creating power with kind of cultures where people get to have a say about what happens to them and the ways in which resources are used. And there's sort of like a shift, if you like, from what Ryan Eisler calls domination cultures to partnering cultures. And I think that's very much evident in the whole notion of what most eco-villages are trying to embody. So that idea of a world that works for everyone, that embodies sort of partnering culture or power with culture, is probably the big picture view. But then within that, if you think about where does prosocial come from, it comes from three big ideas. And the three big ideas are multi-level selection theory within evolutionary theory, Eleanor Ostrom's work on the commons, and work on behavioural science, behaviour change in particular. And so I might just briefly mention each of those three. In terms of evolutionary theory, that's kind of the bedrock upon which prosocial sits. And I think increasingly what's becoming clear as we talk to more and more people and groups around the world, that this is perhaps the most distinctive and newest feature of prosocial, is that it does provide a bit of an alternative to the narrative of humanity as being, you know, selfish utility maximizers that's been pushed for the last 40 or 50 years or so by, you know, the dominance of economics and the way that economics has dominated the world. And so evolutionary theory basically paints a different picture, which is one of that evolution is occurring all the time. It's occurring in in basically every aspect of life. The basic mechanism of evolution is just variation and selection and retention of something. And it might be genes, variation, selection and retention of genes. It might be epigenetic processes. It might be behaviors, you know, that we might try out different. We might try that door behind me and try opening the handle, and at first it doesn't work, so I jiggle it a little bit. And so opening the door is selecting a new behavior, and then I'll remember next time that, you know, this is the way to open that door, is to jiggle the door a little bit. So variation, selection and retention in all streams of life is going on, but also at all levels. And this is what's really key, because it becomes a kind of unifying story that applies not only to individual evolution across the lifespan, but to cultural evolution as well. And that's what we're really about in the end, where, yes, we want to see small local groups survive and thrive in context, but we're also about creating a new cultural narrative, I think, based on this, you know, the best theory of change that we have, namely evolutionary theory. So that's where that's really kind of underpins how we think about behavior change and how we think about cultural change. Then, of course, there's the work from Eleanor Ostrom, and perhaps many of your the people on this call might know of her work. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work. Oh, she won Nobel Prize in economics, but her work was in she worked with groups all around the world that managed common pool resources. And really her work was kind of almost a response to this allegory, if you like, Garrett Hardin's allegory of the tragedy of the commons. The idea that if we have a common space or a shared resource, that it'll inevitably be exploited until it's all gone, that humans, you know, will by their nature, will just overuse it. But really, David Bollier, a commons researcher, has made the point that this was a bit of a mischaracterization. What Harden was really talking about was an unmanaged commons. And what Ostrom's work showed was that when you actually get humans together and they can talk to each other and they can create agreements over time, they can manage shared resources, sometimes very successfully for even thousands of years. We have the capacity to imagine possible futures where all the resources used up, and we have the self-regulatory capacity to be able to not do that, to not overuse it. And so she, her work, and together with her husband, really dived into actual examples of the commons all around the world. And of course, eco-villages are a commons, so this is highly relevant. And she was able to, she didn't find anything that was sort of always the same in every group, but what she was able to do was to infer some principles of organisation that were the same across the groups that tended to succeed for a long period. And that's her 8 core design principles, which I could talk about if you like. And we've really adapted those core design principles just a little, not a lot. We haven't changed them much, but we've adapted them to generalize them beyond the idea of just groups managing common pool resources to any group that's managing a shared purpose of any sort. And then the last idea, and then I realize this is a bit of a long answer, but I'm kind of giving you a bit of an overview of the whole notion, and I hope it's useful. The last sort of source of ideas that goes into prosocial is contextual behavioural science, which is a particular approach to behaviour change that's the target of it is basically to help people develop what we call psychological flexibility. It's the capacity to move in the direction of what really matters, even when it's difficult. And if you're in human relationships, it's often difficult. There's often conflict, there's often hurt, there's often disagreement, there's often doubt and fear of failure and so forth. And basically when we're facing all of that stuff, we can go one of 2 ways. We can connect with what really matters and move in the direction of what I really want to stand for, and being of service to others, and living my values in the life. Or we can go into some kind of fight-flight mode where we're basically acting out of reactivity to that discomfort that is within us. And if you look in groups of all sorts, I've just got some examples here on a screen here, which I was going to use as a reminder. If you look across groups of all sorts that, you know, including eco-villages, you'll see examples of people protecting their turf, you know, fear-driven desire to control others, maybe lack of compassion or positive regard for others, fear of committing to action, all sorts of patterns of behaviour that come out of having difficult emotional experience and going into fight-flight mode in a way that might help the person in the short term to feel a little bit better about themselves or a bit better about what's going on, but generally may not be helpful in terms of building community and building connection between people. So we think, you know, one of the pieces of prosocial that's really powerful is this combination of levels. You've got a grand sort of theory of change. You've got some top-notch Nobel Prize winning work that's allowed us to explore different key principles of how groups can get along with one another. But then we've got the inner, the connection to the inner as well, the capacity to start to look at, you know, how I'm showing up when I'm implementing those principles. And that given that everything we do is a function of our awareness guides our behavior, then doing work on that fundamental awareness of the world is really key. So that's the idea. I haven't talked about process and community and research, but I fear that I'm going on too much, so I might stop there and see if where you'd like to go next.
Yeah, well, that is a great place to pause, and it was a really beautiful share of the big picture, the whole picture, or the whole big picture. And it definitely there are a number of directions that we could go from there. Though, as you were noting, the commons work, and possibly it will be worth unpacking the core design principles, just as a way to sense into some of the complexities that do show up in ecovillages. As Pip shared, as you shared in your intro, ecovillages are fundamentally or essentially a bit of a pro-social environment, and people are drawn there. They're drawn to connect to others. They're drawn to be in a space, facing in together. Yet there still can be, different challenges that will naturally arise. So I think the way that the maybe unpacking the core design principles a little bit, we might go a little deeper into a couple of them, just to explore, how much they really do fit into the eco-village context.
Cool. Yeah, well, so first of all, I did want to say in my intro that I don't live in an eco-village, and I'm not an expert on eco-villages, but my sister Pip does live in that context, and so she can comment on applications of these things. But shall I perhaps give just a quick overview of the 8 principles, and then I could hand over to Pip and she could dive into some applications. How does that sound, Kiala?
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. So this version of the principles that I'm going to give you is actually the version that we develop in our book called Prosocial, with then a very long subtitle that I can never remember, but it's certainly got something to do with using evolutionary theory to help groups be more collaborative and cooperative. So the 8 core design principles, the first one is shared identity and purpose. And in many ways, this is absolutely key to any group. If I don't do any other work with a group, I often am doing some sort of work around building a sense of shared purpose and a sense of belonging in that context, because that's kind of the glue that defines the group. When Ostrom took her first design principle was actually more about group membership, and so it was a little bit different. It was more about who's in and who's out. But when you want to generalize that idea, it's good to think of who's committed to our shared purpose, because that's what creates the possibility of cooperation. Obviously, if someone's pulling in a different direction, that's where a lot of challenges arise. In the context of an eco-village, I imagine that when people are in the eco-village for very different reasons, perhaps some for socioeconomic reasons, some for environmental reasons, and finding some way of sort of stitching together those different aims is going to be really, really key. So that's principle 1. The second principle is equitable distribution of costs and benefits. Really just think of this as equity. But when we're working with people, we don't often talk about, are resources distributed fairly around here? Because that usually doesn't create a very helpful conversation. That usually creates a kind of comparative conversation which may not be that useful. So I like to think of this principle as being about creating a win-win culture, a culture that basically where everyone gets what they need, where their needs are taken care of. And that's really, when you go in with that language, then people are starting to think about others' needs and the good of the group as well as their own. The third principle is fair and inclusive decision making. And from Ostrom's perspective, this was about the idea that the people who are affected by decisions should be involved in the making of them. It's not always possible. Sometimes you need representative circles and so forth that can take carriage of decisions. But the general idea that people should be involved as much as possible to increase buy-in is really key. So it's about sort of moving along that continuum away from more coercive top-down hierarchical systems towards more power with The fourth one is, it's got a terrible name from Ostrom, which is basically about monitoring agreed behaviours. I very rarely use that language, but I talk about transparency, that we should be able to see each other's behaviours. And so in an eco-village, you know, if we can see what people are doing, if we can spend time working with others so that we, or meeting with others so that we can hear what they're up to and so forth. Because it's only in the darkness that self-interest thrives. By the way, all of these principles, it's helpful to think of them from the perspective of what are they trying to do? They're basically trying to help move people from self-interest to thinking for the good of the group, and acting, more importantly, acting for the good of the group. So they're about, in a sense, they're about sort of suppressing selfishness, but they're also about creating a vision of what is the good of the group, the public good, and how can we work in that direction, not to the cost of the individual. It's really, we want to be really careful that we're not talking about some sort of collectivist state-run sort of top-down type of organisation. What we're talking about here is where people are able to express themselves fully, but in the context of the public good, in the context of the good of the group. So that's the first four: shared identity and purpose, equitable distribution of costs and benefits, fair and inclusive decision-making, and transparency of behaviour, or monitoring of behaviour. The fifth one is what Ostrom called graduated sanctions for transgressions. And we call it, we are focused more on graduated responding. So compassionate, graduated responding. If something goes wrong, then obviously we want to start with, you know, hey, what was going on there? But you also need right through, you need a graduated series of responses where if people continue to transgress in a context, there needs to be the option for removal from the group. And this is so true for eco-villages. Many of the people listening to this, I think, will relate to the fact that if you've got a context where there's no possibility of the ultimate sanction of removal from the group, it can lead to huge toxicity where a lot of people start to leave because someone is acting in a way that isn't aligned with the shared purpose of the group. And so it's just I think quite, and this is sort of one of the key learnings for me as a psychologist. I always wanted to, you know, I used to think, oh, well, everyone can be kind of redeemed, everyone can be included, and we just need to get to know them well enough and all that. But you know, no, for the good of the group, there are times where some behaviours just need to result in someone being asked to leave the group. So graduated responding, but that's not all negative. It can also be positive. Like, what do we do to celebrate success? What do we do to encourage helpful behaviour and so forth? The sixth one, fast and fair conflict resolution, obviously key. Whenever people are being authentic at the individual level, there's going to be differences in values, opinions, beliefs, and it's better to anticipate that and to have in place a compassionate, objective approach for managing conflict and responding to it. The seventh one is authority to self-govern, that any group that's going to be really embodying a power with culture has to have the authority of its own to embody those first six principles. If, for example, you had a eco-village that had, you know, really strong council regulations that meant that it was really hard for it to actually do what it needed to do for whatever reason, let's say the housing regulations or whatever interfered with them coming up with a shared purpose and making decisions together, then it's going to be really hard for that village to function. And similarly, you know, a team in a government department, if there's really strong bureaucracy and so forth. So we're very much about empowering teams not to be independent, but to have enough authority to be able to implement those first six principles. And then the last one, sometimes called polycentric governance or appropriate relations with other groups, is really about how does the eco-village get on with other eco-villages, if that's the or with their broader community? How do they sit within? And so that's when it gets fractal and when it gets systemic, that the thing we really love about these core design principles is that they're scalable, that now we can reapply those first seven principles at the level of the next layer up. So we should have hopefully trying to build shared identity and purpose between the village and their community and their broader community. We're trying to build equity with the local area. We're trying to build, you know, transparency and so forth. So that's the 8 core design principles. And I might just hand over to Pip if you'd like to flesh out any examples you've seen in your context.
Thank you, Paul. I might go through each of those design principles, if I've got time, Kayala, to just say how it's relevant to Ecovillage. So the shared purpose, our Ecovillage does have a clear vision, mission, aim around social and economic and environmental sustainability, and we're building an Ecovillage that we hope is our demonstration standard. Now, shared identity and purpose as a principle does include the notion of clearly defined membership, who is part of the group and who isn't. And we have had a membership structure previously that was based on owning land and building a house in the Ecovillage. But now that we're halfway through that exercise, we're needing to revise our definition of membership, or perhaps have extensions to membership that allow us to be welcoming and include more people in our vision and mission. So just a bit of background about Narara Ecovillage. It is a cooperative, and the cooperative owns what I would refer to as the commons, being 34 hectares of land, a floodplain, a dam. We bought some existing infrastructure, buildings, heritage buildings, with our purchase of the land. And so you might say that that is the commons. Since people have started to build their own private house, you know, we've needed a new community legal structure called the Community Association, and their land is not strictly part of the commons, although, of course, as a member, you are part of both. I'll go on to, I think that the village has a very clear vision, mission, and we do tend to attract people who are fairly harmonious with our vision, mission, aim, because there is a thorough, I might call it a screening process, but where each party gets to check each other out by spending time in the community and also saying what it is they want and don't want in a community. So we've been largely successful in attracting like-minded people, which has, you know, resulted in a fairly pro-social community, I think. I hope I don't take too long. The others might be quicker. The CDP 2 about benefits and costs. I could give many examples of where we've dealt with that, but maybe I'll just stick to one issue that is fairly live for us at the moment. Some people have been involved in setting up the Ecovillage for 8+ years, and they're starting to reach a point in time where they're, you know, they might have built their houses, but they're starting to feel a bit maybe tired of driving all the change, and they're wanting to step back. And so this becomes what seems to be a perennial issue in all volunteer organisations of, why is it that just a few do most of the work and everybody benefits? So this is a true cost and benefit example. And I could give a more specific one if needed, but I'm just going to get through a little summary perhaps. So core design principle 3 of fair and inclusive decision making. We are aided in this by having sociocracy as our governance system, and the methods of making fair and inclusive decisions are fairly well spelt out, and a lot of us have done training in how to do that. And, you know, the circles and some methods of communication have been very helpful. So I think that other methods we use in the Ecovillage to ensure fair and inclusive decision making. We have, we have circles, of course. People can so often nominate themselves to a circle or sometimes have to be elected. These circles try and consult widely using a range of methods, you know, be it a meeting, the members meeting, a Slack channel. We have, you know, newsletters, members dispatch. And so we do our best to make people aware that there is a decision going to happen, and we do largely give people the opportunity to participate, at least giving input, if not being part of the final circle that makes the decision. Do you want me to pause, Kayala, or I'll just keep going?
I think you could keep going. Yeah, I think it's good if you do a brief for each, or maybe even choosing a few other ones that, you know, kind of stand out the most. This is great. Okay. to have the real examples, and yeah, I'd love to have a little bit of conversation about them too, as it, you know, maybe after you do a couple more. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you. So CDP4 is about transparency. So we do our best, because people are allowed to fishbowl at meetings. They can sit there, they don't participate, but they can be, you know, they can hear everything that's going on. It's very transparent. We keep good minutes and records, although, you know, to be honest, it can be sometimes a little hard to locate some things, but the minutes and reports are easy to find. You know, roles are swapped out periodically. And then, of course, there's the old community grapevine. So I think people do know what's going on. CDP5, feedback and support. I'd say this is a bit of a live issue for us. I think there's room for improvement. I call it feedback and support. We are starting to get very good at giving positive feedback by way of an appreciation channel on Slack, and even some guerrilla love in action things that were done recently to support people, which are lovely. In terms of giving feedback for not so social behaviour, I think not everyone's trained in giving feedback. And in an eco-village, when you know you're going to be living with people, I think on the whole, we're loath to give feedback that is designed to express some kind of displeasure. And I don't think we're very good at it, to cut a long story short. But I think we will probably improve in that area. As Diana Leaf Christian said, we start out thinking enough hugs will fix it. And then we find out that actually, no, you can do a lot of hugging and it doesn't fix it. CDP 6, conflict. We've had conflicts, of course, as Paul said, they're quite inevitable. And I think we do need development in that area as well, I would say, because, you know, we're all on our learning journey. CDP 7, we do have authority to self-govern. We've got a sociocratic structure, but when Paul was talking, I thought, oh, that's a good point. Part of our reason we have autonomy is because we have self-financed. If a bank had financed us, we wouldn't even be in existence, because we wouldn't have complied with their rules, you know. And also, we do face challenges sometimes with, you know, government zoning and what have you, but we work with those challenges, as everybody has to. And CDP8, I won't say a lot because we've been doing that fairly much on an ad hoc basis rather than a systematic basis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, I really I reflect on a lot of those. I also live in an eco-village context, so I really relate with how you shared. And I think some of those challenges that you described too are universal. And what I also heard you sharing is the aspect of training and learning, and the learning that has already happened in the community. And that's a context for how it does seem that that's who thrives in eco-villages, and eco-villages many times become learning centers or institutes at the same time because of how much learning ends up happening there. One thing I thought we might have a chance to dive into together is a little bit to explore CDP 4 and 5 together, in the sense that it's so interesting to look at to build the culture, to build the muscles of and the psychological flexibility and the experimentation of saying, hey, we want to have more transparency and we want to be able to give critical feedback. And it seems like it's basically a shift in culture. Like you said, it's just maybe no one, it seems commonly that people are not as, they're just reluctant to do it and will often avoid rather than share that. So I'm just curious, just in this moment, sensing into it, how the tools work. Paul, you may have some thoughts on that. Yeah.
Do you want me to start, Pip, or would you like to jump in?
No, please go ahead.
Sure. So we're thinking about, I think this point about avoidance is really key, that it's actually quite common that we've grown up in households where we avoided conflict. Certainly Pip and I did, and haven't necessarily had good models of conflict being a natural part of the process, if you like. One of the things the research evidence points to that's really key is that we need to shift from person-based conflict to task-based conflict. You can, if you look in groups, when there's disagreements around that end up being about who people are and so on, that's very problematic in groups. But disagreements about how we should do things can be highly productive. They can lead to better solutions. So part of the challenge is, well, I see it as skills-based, really, to be honest. I think that we need to help people develop the skills to be in the presence of disagreement, difference, and recognize that it's not personal. It doesn't have to be personal. So one area I was going to mention before that, Pip was talking about sociocracy. And one of the things I really like about prosocial is it's at a level that allows, it's not in any way competing with a whole lot of approaches like sociocracy. And the other one I'm thinking of here in this context is nonviolent communication. I think nonviolent communication is just Marshall Rosenberg's work and particularly Mickey Cashton's work, Reweaving the Human Fabric, is something I would highly recommend. It's an amazing book. But what you see there is this general orientation of being able to respond to people with complete authenticity and courage, but also sensitivity and compassion. And once people have built those skills, then I think this process becomes a lot easier. The other thing I would say is, like all the principles, purpose is really key. So why are we even giving feedback? If it's coming from a space of, I don't like what you did, it's likely to not be very well received. But if it's coming from a space of, this isn't helping our shared purpose, then there's a kind of objectivity to it that that helps it pull in the direction of what really matters. So I think keeping our personal and shared purposes in mind is really key for all of the principles, but particularly these ones. Maybe I'll stop there for a moment. Pip, did you want to add anything to that?
Thank you.
Yes, well, I think I've outlined a bit about transparency. You know, it does help people to feel belonging if they feel they are included and can see what's going on. They're not being excluded. There's no secret stuff going on which would erode community, erode prosociality. So I think I've mentioned the strategies that we use. I think the interesting one here is CDP5, feedback and support, which Paul's touched on. You know, how do we give feedback? And I do think nonviolent communication is a good way. I don't know where this one fits, but there was a very interesting example came up. I'm on a building standards review panel, which the purpose is to uphold environmental standards of building, which also consider the neighbours and the land. And we have a notion of neighbourhood, now consent / agreement / consultation. And I say those three because, would you believe, I think those three words are responsible for a lot of conflict, to be honest, because, and I'm sure we'll get clearer on this. I'm in the middle of it at the moment. So a sociocratic notion of consent would usually imply that your neighbour needs to, well, give consent, I suppose, or good enough for now, safe enough to try sort of consent anyway. And even the word agreement implies that a neighbour somehow needs to be in agreement with what you're going to build. But in fact, the building review panel does not want to be the internal police of building standards. We have a local council whose job it is to do that. And so we've had some real conflicts around this, but it was all because of linguistics, I think, because those two words, consent and agreement, in this context, set up the expectation by the neighbour that they had real say, when in fact it's more their duty, I think, to build collaborative relationships with their neighbour. And just like in anywhere, to give feedback is a privilege based on a relationship that you've established. And then cooperation, of course, and a desire to get on with your neighbour, which most people have, regardless of how unskilled or skilled they are with doing it. Can you relate to that, Kayala, in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think of it again as a space where it's sort of, there's kind of like a minimally sufficient informedness to being able to do a process, right? So for sociocracy, people need a basic understanding of how to do it. And the reason that I think that consent-based decision-making is really powerful compared to consensus, you know, this is something that was a pretty big wave that went through a lot of the communities, because a lot of communities desired to operate in consensus, but you can operate with the spirit of consensus very well using consent and draw that clearer boundary of the purpose and the context as a way to ground. And that was what I heard in your last response too, Paul, that by bringing it to the purpose and the specific context, and then if it's consenting, meaning that harm will not come, you know, is harm going, and that ultimately that the reason for an objection, which would be the only thing that would stop it from happening, would be an objection, and it would need to be a valid objection, meaning one that is a paramount objection, or, you know, whichever language is chosen. I've recently been preferring to use the word valid objection as a way to like ground it, you know, to just say, oh, is that a valid objection, or maybe it's not because it's consent, you know, it's more abstract, or it's based on a bunch of, you know, other assumptions, or it's rooted in people's lack of understanding of the actual process. So I feel you on the complexity with language, and definitely the aspect of how it becomes kind of a stewardship process to bring people into that space. But I like how you framed it, that it's that it is really an exercise of creating an extra step to say, hey, we're inviting your input. This is an invitation. And so it becomes an invitation maybe to unpack the consent process, but and possibly to have it facilitated. And I know you may have that happening in your community too, as far as having your trained facilitators and then being able to rotate or move amongst, so that people, if there's a charge around a topic, or you can have different people come in. Do you have that within your community, Pip? I guess that's a question just for you around having facilitators.
Yeah, it might be in an evolutionary process, that one. We've tried a few different approaches. I don't think we've quite settled on one yet.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. Well, related to this, and you may also share this, but the principle 8 around the groups of groups, one of the ways that I have been applying that in my thinking about it is the way that the Ecovillage definition, there are multiple centers of initiative. And so with the multiple centers of initiative within the Ecovillage, those become distinct purposes, potentially, of groups. And so that's one hope that I've had for the ability to scale, or the ability to increase the coherence in an Ecovillage, whether that's a housing cluster or a domain of effort, like a garden, the gardens or different areas. And so that's one space that I'm seeing even the group of groups within the Ecovillage. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that approach.
I'm going to hand to Pip initially as the sort of lived experience of that. It certainly does seem to me to be a group of groups sort of situation. I suppose I'll hand to Pip and then I'll see if I come up with anything to say.
Yeah, I don't know that I've thought a lot about this, because when you initially said that, I was thinking of the Ecovillage being a group within a larger community. However, you're quite right, Kayla, that all the circles and working groups are groups with their own purpose and their own autonomy as well. So yeah, we have an overarching shared purpose, and we have purpose which is specific to that circle. But due to the double linking of the sociocratic method, that is meant to be designed to enable everyone to stay in alignment with the overarching purpose, which filters down through each of the circles, be they land, team, legal and finance, community, all those circles, to working groups that might be set up for a period of time. So yeah, I don't think I'd love to hear from Paul on this one. Thank you.
Well, Kayla, maybe we can zero in. Do you have a question about this, or I'm just trying to get a feel for how we can help, how we can respond?
Well, and I think it may have been as much of an insight, but it's a piece of a reflection there, that the group of group context, while it can apply, and this is something that within Gen we're seeking to do with our regions and with the scaling of our network stewardship circle, the way that Gen, as an international, there's an international node of Gen, and then there are the regions of Gen, and then there are, within bioregions, there may be more coherence or less, depending. And so part of it for me, from a being part of that network stewardship circle, and being part of Gen North America here, and also having had connection to the board of directors for Gen International as a representative, and being from one of the regions. So I just have this perspective on the complexity of Gen as groups of groups, but then I guess it is the fractal aspect, because I was starting to see an opportunity to create more coherence by really focusing at that task and purpose level, like as you described, like, when we were talking more about principles 5 and 4 and 5, and kind of how they trigger into 6 for creating, having conflicts that might arise based on the way that how transparent things are. But basically, I think I was in a bit of a fractal awareness in that moment, just around that. And I think, Pip, your reflection about the sociocratic process and the way your groups are, I think it's kind of a balance. Yeah.
I mean, this is where one of the ways in which sociocracy, I think, is helpful is this clarity around, for instance, not just the mission, but also the domain of control, the span of control of a particular group, and starting to coordinate that. I mean, this groups of groups challenges, of course, are the biggest challenge facing us as a society, is how do we, get across us and them in many different ways, all the different polarities and divisions that we're building up. How do we create a sense of shared identity and purpose across those boundaries? And I'm guessing that one of the best ways to do that is to live it in one way or another. In the context of an eco-village, I have huge admiration for people who are building and involved in eco-villages, because this is potentially a model for how society can work across difference, both between individuals but also between groups, and also how we can coordinate activity across groups so that we're autonomous enough that we can be efficient and functional and not, hidebound by bureaucracy, but also coordinated well enough across all these different groups that are involved within an ecosystem of the eco-village.
Yes. Yeah, just as you were talking, it just brought to mind the kind of magic ingredient of goodwill and cooperation that helps these groups to coexist and work together. Because needless to say, not all the domain boundaries are clear. There's lack of clarity sometimes. Sometimes there's a lack of something going forward due to the fact people are volunteers and various extenuating circumstances. Sometimes there's a lack of clarity about that. Something just goes off the radar. So all sorts of things can happen. But if there is a bedrock of goodwill and generosity, it's almost like the magic in the Kool-Aid or whatever. It's it honestly, that's what I'm really enjoying about being in the community, is this when you receive generosity and kindness, you pass it on. And we do have we've already got a sort of gifting, bit of a gift economy starting to happen. Lots of, anyone want this, anyone want that. So that's every day on Slack. And when we do get to build businesses in the community, we have already looked at fair shares models and things, but I think I'll just focus on this point about, I've got a bit off point there, that the goodwill, and it's, I'd be interested to hear, I think all of these core design principles, when they're basically working reasonably well, foster that, because surely that's the aim, is a thriving, that's what we want for the world, isn't it? Where people trust and feel they belong and they matter and they're cared for. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. And it got me thinking about how I'm not sure how many eco-villages explicitly do work on culture, but eco-villages have a culture, and we've talked a lot about purpose, but culture is sort of like the expression of the values, how we're going to achieve that purpose, if you like. And I think that's equally important. I often say in the prosocial training that trust comes about when vulnerability is richly reinforced, and that's sort of behavioural speak for saying that we're basically, there are many contexts where people are vulnerable, and if they're met with judgment or rigidity around rules or whatever, then that's going to make them pull back and withdraw and lead to disconnection. But if they're met with a sort of rich compassion that Pip's talking about, and the culture of generosity that she's pointing to, then I think what that does is over time lead to that flowering, if you like, of trust, that people know that they can afford to be vulnerable and authentic, and they're going to be met with understanding. You know, so there's this whole realm of the heart that's involved in this work, that it's not a machine. And sometimes I do worry a little bit that we see sociocracy, for instance, and I'm not saying this is true of sociocracy, but I think it can be read this way, that it's like a technical solution, if you like. And this is where I think all this work around the heart that we bring to this, and the sense of others, and the sense that maybe, you know, we don't have all the answers, we don't have to protect or defend ourselves, this sense of maturity, you know. So sorry, I'm getting off track here, but you know, this work around our own personal evolution, how can eco-villages support the growth of wisdom in their members, that allow us to take a bigger perspective on what it is we're trying to do, and to be slightly less reactive or attached to a particular story of how things are unfolding, that can create that kind of compassion that builds trust, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that in the spirit of that, you know, yeah, trust and belonging, those like essential qualities and essential experiences, that I do believe that is a lot of what within the eco-village movement, you know, even within Jen, there's a lot of a focus around understanding the dimensions, you know, the social, ecological, economic, you know,
Nice.
and all the dimensions of life in that way. And so then it really is an integral or a whole systems design approach to living, and whether and the ways in which some eco-villages may have a specific orientation for their purpose, or a culture that develops in a certain way. And I think that aspect, especially with the intention or the willingness to keep growing, to keep learning, which is really a shared intention within a lot. And there's one piece that I think is especially really powerful in this time with so much volatility, or needs to be able to support folks in different ways, that the way that mutual aid kind of ties to that principle too, in a way. And Pip, I think you were starting to speak a little bit about enterprise within the communities or businesses, and how those are another way to help support the members in a community, or, you know, especially to be able to create opportunities. And that's one of the parts where I also have been seeing a pattern for the ways that eco-villages can also support the surrounding communities, or create opportunities for others, and to have the spirit of goodwill that's in that principle of the win-win, the way you describe as a win-win, that as a pattern and a principle. It's one of the areas that I think you know, it's a critical area to be able to work, so that we can share resources and share opportunities, and you know, and yeah, so that maybe it's probably a good time to do some, you know, some rounding out thoughts. If we each wanted to share some other thoughts, and before we finish, I do want to, you know, invite people for some next steps or ways to learn more. But we can just have some last thoughts on this conversation.
Yes, I'd like to add a thought so Paul can do the wrap, if that's all right. Paul mentioned, you know, I mean, it's a big word, contextual behavioural science, but basically, and then there's another one, psychological flexibility. But look, all that really means is that within eco-villages and everywhere, it is important to hold your own story lightly. You know, you have perceived a situation, you know, you've got impressions, maybe perceptions, maybe beliefs about another person. But the psychological flexibility piece of prosocial training does sort of help us to hold that lightly and try and see things from other people's perspective, and not buy into being right. So that's the other thing that goes along with the kindness, is the psychological flexibility. And I'm sure Paul can speak more about that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
I don't have too much more to add. I think I've probably said enough. I was just thinking about how the language of needs that's in nonviolent communication is so key. The language of kind of owning one's own experience and keeping. I often say to myself that I'm no more nor less important than anyone else. And if we come back to the sort of where we started of this idea of a world that works for everyone, you know, in an eco-village, that's central, that idea of an eco-village that works for everyone. But I actually think we've kind of covered that enough, that it's really about this orientation to building groups that work. It's not about some technical solution. It's not about some framework even. Even these 8 core design principles need to be held lightly, but they are a pointer towards some of the conversations that we need to have. And then those conversations need to be coming from a space of what really matters to me and what really matters to you. So that's perhaps all I could just sort of reiterate some of the points that we've been talking about. In terms of where to from here, where to learn more, would you like me to talk a bit about that, Kayla?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to share a little more, because I know, having read the book myself and having had a little dip into it, I know there's just a lot more, and I'm actually looking forward to taking a little bit more of a dive myself. So yeah, good share.
Right. Well, there's a couple of main things that people can do if they'd like to learn more. One of them is to go to our website, Prosocial.World, www.prosocial.world. And from there you can see all sorts of videos and blogs and things like that. We also have a closely allied site, which is also developed by David Sloan Wilson, the co-founder of Prosocial.World, and that is called This View of Life, and that's well worth taking a look at. Some amazing interviews and reports and things on taking an evolutionary perspective on life. So I think those resources are really well worth taking a look at. And one of the things you'll see on the Prosocial.World site is a link to our training offering. We have a 10-week facilitator training course in Prosocial. We haven't, as it's turned out, talked at all about the process of Prosocial, but I guess I'll add at this point that, you know, we have basically a approach for exploring each of the core design principles in a way that allows people to surface not only what matters most to them, but also what are they most afraid of, what are they most concerned about, and to get that out into the conversation where, and also what does that have them doing? What do those loves and fears have them doing in a way? And obviously what we're trying to do in eco-villages and in life in general, most people don't want to be living out of fear or what they don't want. They want to be living out of love and what they do want in life. And we're trying to, we've got, you know, tools that really help people make that shift in the conversation. So if we're talking about equity, instead of getting stuck in, he got more than she got, you know, to say, well, what really matters to us here, and how do we create that again in a win-win sort of way? Or if we're talking about, inclusive decision making. You know, there's fear that comes up in that process. It's going to take too long. It's going to get out of control. It'll create conflict. People are afraid of consent-based decision making sometimes, and we need to have ways of being able to talk about the fears and the difficulties that come up. And so that's what the process is about. It just occurred to me that I hadn't talked about that at all. The process is about how you can help facilitate groups through those conversations, even where they touch the difficult parts. And so there's a 10-week training in that, which you can access the details about through Prosocial.World. At the time of speaking, it's there's a new course coming up on the 19th of April. So if anyone's interested in joining that, we'd certainly love to welcome you. We have you know, rates vary from not-for-profits and so forth. And the other resource is the Prosocial book. If you just, I should have a link handy for that, but if you just Google my name and Prosocial, you'll come up with a book. Oh, there we go. Pip's got a copy of it. Handily being modelled on the screen.
Yes, hard to get focus.
Yeah, and that's got a lot of information and about each of the principles and the idea of psychological flexibility and so forth. Yeah, so a couple of very useful resources.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, as I mentioned, yeah, I have the book here too, and it's very inspiring. I really appreciate each of you for your time today, and yeah, it's such a great resource, and I look forward to being in touch in the time ahead. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Carlo. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.